hug?
No.
Give me a hug.
No way.
Come here.
I'm not coming over there.
Let's go.
Forget it.
Pronto.
What are you doing?
I'm with it. I'm hip. Don't look at me like I'm frickin' Frankenstein. Give your father a hug.
Hey, touch me!
Get away from me, you lazy-eyed psycho! Right.
It's no hassle. But all I'm saying, they're gonna get away.
No.
Look, even before you start, that was preemptive. Just know I have a whole bag of with your name on it.
We were laughing about going to restaurants and having to spend our time taking selfies with people.
At least they're still asking, you know.
Yeah, that's right. You always want to be underestimated by your adversaries. He consistently benefited by being underestimated. And so did I, for totally different reasons. I want to say one thing nice about my friend here. I'll say more than one thing, but this particular one thing I would say. He used to call me twice a year in his second term, just to talk. We'd talk, depending on how much time he had, because he was busier than me, somewhere between 30 and 45 minutes for several years. It meant a lot to me. We never talked about it in public.
We all hope the very best for Chelsea, and that the child's health be strong, like I'm confident it will be. Anyway, it's going to be an awesome period for you. And yeah, get ready also to be like the lowest person in the pecking order in your family.
When you said that George W. Bush, which was our last Republican president, a man I respect greatly, a person that we really fought for when he was up against a lot of pressure, that he lied to get us in the war in Iraq. That stung me very deeply. Okay. I don't believe that. I'm just wondering, given some time passing, perhaps you've rethought that. Would you be willing to rethink that?
Well, a lot of people agree with what I said, and I'm not talking about lying. I'm not talking about not lying. Nobody really knows why we went into Iraq. The Iraqis did not knock down. It was not Saddam Hussein that knocked down the World Trade Center. Okay,
that's just what you said was they lied. They said there were weapons of mass destruction, and there were none, and they knew there were none. There were no weapons of mass.
Well, there are a lot of people that think that. There were a lot of people that think, look, bottom line, there were no weapons of mass destruction. They said there are weapons of mass destruction. I was against the war when it started.
Do you think the president of the United States, George W. Bush, lied?
Well, look,
to
I'm not going to
American
get you a
people?
vote, but that's okay. Let me
I'm just giving you another shot.
Let me tell you something. I'll tell you very simply. It may have been the worst decision going into Iraq, may have been the worst decision anybody has made, any president has made in the history of this country. That's how bad it is, okay? Here's what happens. We have spent $2 trillion in Iraq and fighting Iraq. $2 trillion. $2 trillion. Thousands of lives, right? We have wounded warriors who I love all over the place. These are the most incredible. These are braver than all of us in this room put together. I look at the attitude, and I work with them, and these are great people. We got nothing. We have nothing. We're not even there. We can't even make a phone call right now.
But to his question,
I'm trying to separate.
Let me tell you. Do I know?
Do you believe he lied, or did he?
I can tell you this. I don't, whether he lied or not. He went into Iraq. It was a horrible decision.
You were both in Skull and Bones, the secret society.
It's so secret we can't talk about it.
What does that mean for America? The conspiracy theorists are going to go
I'm
wild.
sure they are. I don't know. I haven't seen the rest.
Number
of it.
322.
First of all, he's not the nominee, and look, I look
Are
forward.
you prepared to lose?
No, I'm not going to lose.
You both were members of Skull and Bones, a secret society at Yale. What does that tell us?
Not much, because it's a secret.
Is there a secret handshake? Is there a secret code?
I wish there were something secret I could manifest.
322, a secret number?
There are all kinds of secrets, Tim, but one thing is not a secret. I disagree with this president's direction that he's taking the country. We can do a better job, and I intend to do it.
And we'll be watching. Be safe on the campaign trail. John Kerry, thanks for joining us. And we'll be right back.
March 13th, 1962. Lyman Lemnitzer, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, presents a proposal to Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, named Operation Northwoods. The document proposed staging terrorist attacks in and around Guantanamo Bay to provide a pretext for military intervention in Cuba. The plans included starting rumors about Cuba using clandestine radio, landing friendly Cubans inside the base to stage attacks, starting riots at the main gate, blowing up ammunition inside the base, starting fires, sabotaging aircraft and ships on the base, bombing the base with mortar shells, sinking a ship outside the entrance, staging funerals for mock victims, staging a terror campaign in Miami, Florida, and Washington, D.C., and finally, destroying a drone aircraft over Cuban waters. The passengers, federal agents in reality, would allegedly be college students on vacation. A plane at Eglin Air Force Base would be painted and numbered as a duplicate of a registered civil aircraft belonging to a CIA front in Miami. The duplicate would be substituted for the real plane and loaded with the passengers. The real plane would be converted into a drone. The two planes would rendezvous south of Florida. The passenger-laden plane would land at Eglin Air Force Base to evacuate its passengers and return to its original status. The drone would pick up the scheduled flight plan and, over Cuban waters, transmit a Mayday signal before being blown up by remote control. The plan is rejected by McNamara, and President John F. Kennedy personally removes Lemnitzer as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. December 1st, 1984. A remote-controlled Boeing 720 takes off from Edwards Air Force Base and is crash-landed by NASA for fuel research. Before its destruction, the plane flew a total of 16 hours and 22 minutes, including 10 takeoffs, 69 approaches, and 13 landings. August 1997. The cover of FEMA's Emergency Response to Terrorism depicts the World Trade Center in crosshairs. February 28th, 1998. The Global Hawk, Raytheon's unmanned aircraft vehicle, completes its first flight over Edwards Air Force Base in California at an altitude of 32,000 feet, cruising altitude for a commercial jetliner. 1999. NORAD begins conducting exercises in which hijacked airliners are flown into the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. June 2000. The Department of Justice releases a terrorism manual with the World Trade Center in crosshairs. September 2000. The Project for a New American Century, a neo-conservative think tank whose members include Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, Jeb Bush, and Paul Wolfowitz, releases their report entitled Rebuilding America's Defenses. In it, they declare that the process of transformation, even if it brings revolutionary change, is likely to be a long one, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event, like a new Pearl Harbor. October 24th, 2000. The Pentagon conducts the first of 2 training exercises called Moscow, which simulate a Boeing 757 crashing into the building. April 2001. NORAD plans an exercise in which a plane is flown into the Pentagon, but is rejected as too unrealistic. June 2001. The Department of Defense initiates new instructions for military intervention in the case of a hijacking. It states that for all non-immediate responses, the Department of Defense must get permission directly from the Secretary of Defense. Attorney General John Ashcroft begins flying on chartered jets for the remainder of his term due to a threat assessment by the FBI. July 4th, 2001. Osama bin Laden, wanted by the United States since 1998, receives medical attention at the American hospital in Dubai, where he is visited by a local chief of the CIA. July 24th, 2001. Larry A. Silverstein, who already owned World Trade Center 7, signs a $3.2 billion 99-year lease on the entire World Trade Center complex 6 weeks before 9/11. Included in the lease is a $3.5 billion insurance policy, specifically covering acts of terrorism. September 6th, 2001, 3,150 put options are placed on United Airlines stock. A put option is a bet that a stock will fall. That day, put options were more than 4 times its daily average. Bomb-sniffing dogs are pulled from the World Trade Center, and security guards end 2 weeks of 12-hour shifts. September 7th, 2001. 27,294 put options are placed on Boeing stock, more than 5 times the daily average. September 10th, 2001. 4,516 put options are placed on American Airlines, almost 11 times its daily average. San Francisco Mayor Willie Brown receives a phone call warning him not to fly the next morning. And in Pakistan, at a military hospital, all of the urologists are replaced by a special team in order to host their guest of honor, Osama bin Laden, who is carefully escorted inside to be washed carefully and looked after. September 11th, 2001. The National Reconnaissance Office in Chantilly, Virginia, is preparing for an exercise in which a small corporate jet crashes into their building. NORAD is in the middle of a number of military exercises. The first, Vigilant Guardian, is described as an exercise that would pose an imaginary crisis to North American air defense outposts nationwide. The second, Northern Vigilance, moved fighter jets to Canada and Alaska to fight off an imaginary Russian fleet. 3 F-16s from Washington, D.C.'s National Guard at Andrews Air Force Base, 15 miles from the Pentagon, are flown 180 nautical miles away for a training mission in North Carolina. This left 14 fighter jets to protect the entire United States.
Hi, Boston Center Team U. We have a problem here. We have a hijacked aircraft headed towards New York, and we need you guys we need someone to scramble some F-16s or something up there to help us out.
Is this real world or exercise?
No, this is not an exercise, not a test.
The first question I have is basically to get from you a sense of how you would rate the American media in their coverage of the events of the attack last September.
Well, let's see. Shamefully is a word that comes to mind.
This just in, you are looking at obviously a very disturbing live shot there. That is the World Trade Center, and we have unconfirmed reports this morning that a plane has crashed into one of the towers of the World Trade Center.
But overall, the American journalism was cowed and intimidated by this massive flag sucking, this patriotic orgy. You know, if you criticize the president, it's unpatriotic and there's something wrong with you, you may be a terrorist.
So in that sense, Hunter S. Thompson, there's not enough room for dissenting voices?
Well, there's plenty of room. There's just not enough people are willing to take the risk.
Jim, I don't know whether we've confirmed that this was an aircraft, or to be more specific, some people said they thought they saw a missile.
There was definitely a blue logo. It was like a circular logo on the front of the plane. It definitely did not look like a commercial plane. I didn't see any windows on the sides.
Mark, if what you say is true, those could be cargo planes. You said you didn't see any windows in the side?
I didn't see any windows on the side. It was not a normal flight that I've ever seen at an airport. It was a plane that had a blue logo on the front, and it did not look like it belonged in this area.
It's just sort of a herd mentality, a lemming-like mentality. If you don't go with the flow, you're anti-American and therefore a suspect.
This is as close as we can get to the base of the World Trade Center. You can see the firemen assembled here, the police officers, FBI agents, and you can see the two towers. A huge explosion now raining debris on all of us. We better get out of the way.
Do you think that the event completely transformed the way in which Americans see themselves and their own vulnerability?
No, the event by itself would not have done that. You sort of wonder when something like that happens, well, who stands to benefit? You know, who had the opportunity and the motive? You just kind of look at these basic things. I don't assume that I know the truth about what went on that day. And yeah, I just look around and looking for, well, who had the motive, who had the opportunity, who had the equipment, who had the will. I spent enough time on the inside of, well, the White House, and I've been in, campaigns, and I've known enough of the people who do these things to know that the public version of the news of an event is never really what happened. And these people, I think, are willing to take that even further.
It seems a very long bow to me, but are you sort of suggesting that this worked in the favour of the Bush administration?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
(9:38), Arlington, Virginia. Hani Hanyor allegedly executes a 330-degree turn at 530 miles per hour, descending 7,000 feet in 2.5 minutes to crash American Airlines Flight 77 into the ground floor of the Pentagon.
The airplane could not possibly have flown at those speeds which they said it did without going through what they call a high-speed stall. The airplane won't go that fast and start pulling those high G maneuvers at those bank angles.
Its final approach took it directly across Interstate 395. Knocking light poles out of the ground and bouncing off of the lawn before impact. First, let's meet Hani Hanyor. Hanyor had come to Freeway Airport in Bowie, Maryland 1 month earlier seeking to rent a small plane. However, when Hanyor went on 3 test runs in the second week of August, he had trouble controlling and landing a single-engine Cessna 172.
Well, my name is Marcel Bernard, and I'm the chief flight instructor here at Freeway. Hani Hanyor, well, basically what happened with him is he showed up at the airport and wanted to get checked out in the aircraft. See, he was already certified. He didn't come to us for flight training.
Yeah, he already had a pilot's license.
He had already earned his private instrument commercial at a school in Arizona, and I don't remember the name of the school, but he already had certificates in hand. And we sometimes occasionally have pilots that come to us that don't want flight training but just want to rent our aircraft.
Which is the case of Hani Hanjour.
This was the case with Hani. He wanted to get checked out, as we call it, to rent our aircraft. And our insurance requires that he flies with one of our instructors to be found competent to rent.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the process that he was going through. The consensus was that he was very quiet, average or below average piloting skills.
Mm-hmm.
English was very poor. So I don't know where to. That's about the best description I can give you for his demeanor
Mm-hmm.
at that time. Very, uneventful from our perspective.
Regardless, air traffic controllers at Dulles International Airport that were tracking Flight 77 all thought that it was a military plane. Second, the light poles. On November 22, 2004, a private jet en route to Houston to pick up George Bush Sr. clipped a single light pole and crashed a minute away from landing at Houston's Hobby Airport. The wing ripped off upon impact, scattering debris over 100 yards. And yet, Flight 77 managed to tear 5 light poles completely out of the ground without damaging either the wings or the light poles themselves. Instead, they seem to have just popped out of the ground. Third, you only have to look at the photos from that day to realize that whatever hit the Pentagon did not bounce off the lawn. If Flight 77 had crash landed and skidded into the Pentagon, it would have looked like this. Instead, it looked like this, without a single scratch on the lawn. Fourth, why is there absolutely no trace of Flight 77? The official explanation is that the intense heat from the jet fuel vaporized the entire plane. Indeed, from these pictures, it seems that there is absolutely no trace of a Boeing 757. But if the fire was hot enough to incinerate a jumbo jet, then how can investigators identify 184 out of 189 people found at the Pentagon? The Armed Forces DNA Identification Laboratory, which was responsible for the task, was also responsible for identifying the dead in Shanksville. Titanium has a melting point of 1,688 degrees Celsius. Jet fuel, also known as kerosene, is a hydrocarbon, which can retain a constant temperature of 1,120 degrees Celsius after 40 minutes, but only if the fuel is maintained. The fuel would have burned off immediately upon impact. Therefore, it is scientifically impossible that 12 tons of steel and titanium was vaporized by kerosene. Likewise, the 2 engines should have been found relatively intact at the Pentagon. Instead, there was a single turbojet engine approximately 3 feet in diameter found inside the building. The second identifiable piece of debris was allegedly a piece of the fuselage. Skeptics have claimed that this is proof that Flight 77 hit the Pentagon, but this piece could have come from any American Airlines plane. And why is it not singed or scratched after a 530 mile/hour impact and a subsequent fireball? The third piece of debris was a diffuser case. Let's look a little closer at the diffuser case of a 757. Do you see the triangular bezels around the openings? Those are nowhere to be found on the case found at the Pentagon. The remainder of the debris was light enough to have been carried by hand. If Flight 77 was vaporized on impact, it would be the first time in aviation history. For example, August 15th, 2005, Helios Airways Flight 522, a Boeing 737 en route to Athens, Greece, crashed into a hillside at full speed. 121 passengers, all dead. Fire. Tail sections. Wing sections. Engines. Cockpit. Bodies. Fifth, why is the damage to the Pentagon completely inconsistent with a Boeing 757? These photos were taken before the roof of the outer ring had collapsed. The only damage to the outer wall is a single hole, no more than 16 feet in diameter. A Boeing 757 is 155 feet long, 44 feet high, has a 124-foot wingspan and weighs almost 100 tons. Are we supposed to believe that it disappeared into this hole without leaving any wreckage on the outside? Why is there no damage from where the wings, or the vertical stabilizer, or the engines would have slammed into the building? Remember how big the engines were? If 6 tons of steel and titanium slammed into the Pentagon at 530 miles per hour, they would bury themselves inside the building, leaving 2 very distinct imprints. And yet, the only damage on the outside of the Pentagon is this single hole, with no damage from where the engines would have hit. Why are the windows next to the hole completely intact? Why are the cable spools directly in front of the hole completely untouched? And as for the inside of the Pentagon, there's another hole, approximately 16 feet in diameter, found on the other side of the C-ring, 3 rings from the impact. For that hole to have been caused by Flight 77, the Boeing would have had to smash through 9 feet of steel-reinforced concrete. The nose of a commercial airliner is composed of lightweight carbon. This is what usually happens to the nose of a commercial airliner in a plane crash. If the nose caused this hole, where's the rest of the debris from the plane? So what could blow a 16-foot hole in the outer ring of the Pentagon, smash through 9 feet of steel-reinforced concrete, and leave another 16-foot hole? A cruise missile. This is what Slobodan Milosevic's residence in Belgrade looked like after a Tomahawk cruise missile had hit it. See any similarities? 6th, the eyewitnesses. Some saw a huge 100-ton commercial airliner
to a standstill, and I looked off. I was, looked out my window. I saw this plane, a jet, American Airlines jet, coming.
Some saw a small 8 to 20 passenger commuter plane.
So it looked to be maybe a 20-passenger corporate jet, no markings on the side, coming in at a shallow angle like it was landing right into the side of the Pentagon.
And some saw a United States military helicopter.
He said that he saw a helicopter circle the building. He said that it appeared to be a U.S. military helicopter and that it disappeared behind the building where the helicopter landing zone is, and that he then saw a fireball go into the sky.
So who's telling the truth? Take this into consideration. April Gallup was working in the Pentagon's west side when it was hit. In Jim Mars's book, Inside Job, April claims, while in the hospital, men in suits visited her more than once. They never identified themselves or what agency they worked for. They didn't tell her what to say, just made suggestions. For example, to take the compensation money and shut up. They also kept insisting that a plane hit the building. They repeated this over and over. But I was there, and I never saw a plane, or even debris from a plane. I figured this story is to brainwash people. So if a Boeing 757 didn't hit the Pentagon, then what did? Eyewitnesses inside and outside the building were thrown to the ground by what they described as a shockwave. Even the Sheraton Hotel, 1.6 miles away, was rocked by the blast. A number of military personnel at the Pentagon specifically mentioned smelling cordite. Cordite and jet fuel have 2 very distinct smells. Cordite is a compound used in ammunition which is comprised of nitroguanidine, nitrocellulose, and nitroglycerin. It is cool burning, produces little smoke and no flash, but produces a strong detonation wave. And eyewitnesses described a bright, silvery flash. Jet fuel combustion, i.e., the planes that struck the Twin Towers, is bright yellow at best. Watch this. A massive smoldering fireball. No silvery flash, no shockwave. And at the Pentagon, a tiny, bright, silvery flash, which shakes nearby buildings. Whatever it was, it might have been related to the 2 planes that were in the air after the crash. The first one was uniformly identified as a C-130. The second plane was an unmarked white plane flying over Washington, D.C.
A white plane, a very big jet, was flying in an unusual pattern near the White House over Lafayette Park. Very slowly, it made one circle, and then we have not seen it since. But again, it's only speculation, but most people say that since flights have been cleared from U.S. airspace and it was a totally white plane, looked unusual to all of us, that it was a government plane of some kind.
7th, surveillance cameras from a gas station, Sheraton Hotel, and the Virginia Department of Transportation captured the entire thing. However, the FBI was there within minutes to confiscate the tapes, including a warning for the employees not to discuss what they had seen. If the government wishes to prove once and for all that Flight 77 hit the Pentagon, all they would have to do is release one of those tapes. Instead, they released 5 frames from a camera across the heliport, even though none of them show a 757. And is it merely a coincidence that the Pentagon was hit in the only section that was renovated to withstand that very same kind of attack? And that Donald Rumsfeld was safe in his office on the opposite end of the building? If the government has nothing to hide, why are they so afraid to answer a few questions or release a few videos? (9:59), New York City, New York. The South Tower of the World Trade Center collapses to the ground in approximately 10 seconds. 29 minutes later, the North Tower follows suit, collapsing in approximately 10 seconds. Later that evening at 5:20, World Trade Center 7, a 47-story office building 300 feet away from the North Tower, suddenly collapses. The building's tenants included the CIA, Department of Defense, IRS, Secret Service, and Rudy Giuliani's emergency bunker. And the SEC was using it to store 3,000 to 4,000 files related to numerous Wall Street investigations. Although every single building surrounding Building 7 stood intact, it fell straight down into a convenient little pile in 6 seconds. Official explanation? Falling debris from the Twin Towers created an internal fire, which ignited several fuel tanks inside the building. If this is true, then it would be the 3rd building in history to collapse because of a fire. The first 2 would be the Twin Towers.
It was July 28, 1945, the Empire State Building, with a B-25 bomber knifing through the fog on its way to New York City. The Army bomber, carrying its pilot and 2 passengers, had crashed into the giant building between the 78th and 79th floors.
14 people dead, $1 million in damage. But the building stands intact to this day. On February 14th, 1975, a 3-alarm fire broke out between the 9th and 14th floors of the North Tower. According to the New York Times, the fire leads to intense scrutiny of the towers and eventually to a decision to install sprinklers. On May 4th, 1988, a 62-story skyscraper in Los Angeles burned for 3 hours and spread over 4 floors. It did not collapse. On February 23, 1991, a 38-story skyscraper in Philadelphia, built in 1973, burned for more than 19 hours and spread over 8 floors. It did not collapse. On October 17, 2004, a 56-story skyscraper in Venezuela, built in 1976, burned for over 17 hours and spread over 26 floors, eventually reaching the roof. Guess what? It did not collapse. On February 12, 2005, the Windsor Building in Madrid, a 32-story tower framed in steel-reinforced concrete, burned for almost 24 hours, completely eradicating the upper 10 stories of the building. Although the top 10 floors of the building fell, the building itself did not collapse. And yet, on September 11th, 2001, two 110-story skyscrapers, completed in 1973, burned for 56 and 103 minutes, respectively, over 4 floors, before collapsing completely to the ground. One might argue that this was due to the construction of the World Trade Center. Let's look at what was inside those buildings. The Twin Towers were composed of 200,000 tons of steel, 425,000 cubic yards of concrete, 103 elevators, 43,600 windows, 60,000 tons of cooling equipment, and a 360-foot television antenna. The core of each tower was 87 by 133 feet, comprised of 47 box columns 36 by 16 inches thick. The North Tower was completed in 1970, standing at 1,368 feet tall, and the South Tower was completed in 1973, clocking in at 1,362 feet tall, making them the tallest buildings in the world until the Sears Tower was completed in 1974. And to think, the government would have us believe that these massive structures were destroyed by 10,000 gallons of jet fuel. However, eyewitnesses, video footage, and a little common sense quickly refutes that claim. The second plane hits the South Tower between the 78th and 82nd floors at 9:03 a.m. Barely hitting the southeast corner, the majority of the jet fuel exploding outside in a massive fireball. Yet, this tower collapses first, even though the North Tower was hit straight on and had already been burning for 18 minutes longer. Galileo's law of falling bodies calculates the time in which an object will travel a certain distance in complete freefall. The South Tower was 1,362 feet tall. 1362 equals 16.08 times 84.7, or 9.2 seconds. The Twin Towers came down in nearly free-fall speed. 200,000 tons of steel shatters into sections no longer than a couple feet long. 425,000 cubic yards of concrete is pulverized into dust. Thousands of lives are extinguished instantly. So what brought down the World Trade Center? Let's ask the experts. Van Romero, Vice President for Research at New Mexico Institute of Mining and Technology. My opinion is, based on the videotapes, after the airplanes hit the World Trade Center, there were some explosive devices inside that caused the towers to collapse. The collapses were too methodical to be a chance result of airplanes colliding with the structures. 10 days later, certainly the fire is what caused the building to fail. Why would Romero change his mind so suddenly? Hyman Brown, civil engineering professor and the World Trade Center's construction manager. It was over-designed to withstand almost anything, including hurricanes, high winds, bombings, and an airplane hitting it. Although the buildings were designed to withstand a 150-year storm and the impact of a Boeing 707, jet fuel burning at 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit weakened the steel. Kevin Ryan, Underwriters Laboratories, the company that certified the steel that was used in the World Trade Center, in a letter to Frank Gale of the National Institute of Standards and Technology. We know that the steel components were certified to ASTM E119. The time temperature curves for this standard required the samples to be exposed to temperatures around 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit for several hours, and as we all agree, the steel applied met those specifications. Additionally, I think we can all agree that even unfireproof steel will not melt until reaching red-hot temperatures of nearly 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Why Dr. Brown would imply that 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit would melt the high-grade steel used in those buildings makes no sense at all. This story just does not add up. If steel from those buildings did soften or melt, I'm sure we can all agree that this was certainly not due to jet fuel fires of any kind, let alone the briefly burning fires in those towers. Ryan's statements directly contradict statements from so-called experts which claim that 2,000-degree heat inside the World Trade Center caused the towers to collapse. Days after writing this letter, Kevin Ryan was fired from his position. Not even the experts agree with each other. So what else could have caused the Twin Towers in Building 7 to collapse?
10 o'clock Eastern Time this morning, just collapsing on itself.
The second building that was hit by the plane has just completely collapsed.
We have no idea what caused this.
Almost looks like one of those planned implosions.
As if a demolition team set off. When you see the old demolitions of these old buildings, it folded down on itself and it is not there anymore.
If you wish to bring anybody who's ever watched a building being demolished on purpose knows that if you're going to do this, you have to get at the under infrastructure of a building and bring it down.
We heard another explosion, and I'm assuming that's the one that came from the lower level, since there were two. And I said,
right, because it was like 18 minutes apart.
Well, this is the first explosion, and there was a second explosion in the same building. There were two explosions.
Okay. Federal agencies that were down there do believe that there was some sort of explosive device somewhere else besides the planes hitting.
NBC's Pat Dawson is close to the scene of that attack. Pat?
Just moments ago, I spoke to the chief of safety for the New York City Fire Department. Chief Albert Turry, he received word of the possibility of a secondary device, that is another bomb going off. He tried to get his men out as quickly as he could, but he said that there was another explosion which took place. And then an hour after the first hit here, with the first crash that took place, he said, there was another explosion that took place in one of the towers here. He thinks that there were actually devices that were planted in the building. The second device, he speculates, was probably planted in the building.
There were 2 or 3 similar huge explosions, and the building literally shook. You literally shook at the base of this building.
First one and then the other. Some say after secondary explosions.
Big explosion happened. All of a sudden the elevator blew up, smoke. I dragged the guy out. His skin was hanging off, and I dragged him out, and I helped him out to the ambulance.
Just get out of the tunnel and it blew.
The subway tunnel?
Yeah.
Collapsed.
5 blocks from the World Trade Center. And we were standing here when there was some sort of collapse or explosion. Do you know if it was an explosion or if it was a building collapse?
To me, it sounded like an explosion.
When I tried to save people, in the moment we heard a big explosion coming down. Everything just went black. Everything came down, glass started popping. People got hurt, stuff went on top of them, and it was a big explosion. Everything got dark, real dark, like snow.
The FBI is here, as you can see. They had roped this area off. They were taking photographs and securing this area just prior to that huge explosion that we all heard and felt.
At 10:30, I tried to leave the building, but as soon as I got outside, I heard a second explosion and another rumble and more smoke and more dust. I ran inside the buildings, the chandelier shook, and again, black smoke filled the air. Within another 5 minutes, we were covered again with more silt and more dust. And then a fire marshal came in and said we had to leave because if there was a third explosion, this building might not last.
Ginny Carr was attending a business meeting on the 36th floor of One Liberty Plaza, across the street from the World Trade Center, and caught the entire first attack on tape. A second explosion can be heard 9 seconds after the crash.
It sounded like something crashed.
So what happened in the North Tower? Ask Willie Rodriguez. Willie, a janitor who worked in the World Trade Center for 20 years, was in sub-level 1 when the North Tower was hit.
And all of a sudden we hear boom! I thought it was a generator that blew up on the basement. And I said to myself, oh my God, I think it's a generator. And I was going to verbalize it. When I finished saying that in my mind, I hear boom! Right on the top, pretty far away. So it was a difference between coming from the basement and coming from the top. And that's, everybody started screaming. And a person comes running into the office saying, explosion, explosion, explosion. He got his hand extended and all the skin was pulled from his under his arm, all the way to the top of the fingertips, and he was hanging on both arms. Hanging and hanging. And then I look at his face and he was missing parts on his face. And I said, what happened? What happened? And
And he said, the elevators, the elevators. There were many explosions, and when I actually talk about those explosions, they said that, well, there were so many kitchens in the building, and they have probably those gas canisters. And I say, I don't believe that, because the building was a Class A building. There are very strict guidelines of what you can put in a kitchen. And I really doubt it was gas. So there was a lot of misconceptions of what happened on that day in terms of the explosions. But up to date, I haven't received an actual explanation about the different explosions that I heard on the upper floors and not all the way to the top.
The windows in the lobby of the North Tower were blown out, and marble panels were blown off of the walls. This was brushed off as damage from a raging fireball that went barreling down the elevator shafts. On 9/11, New York City lost 343 firefighters at the World Trade Center. Since they were the ones inside the towers before and as they collapsed, I'd say they've got a pretty good grasp on what happened. So what does the FDNY think? First, we had this interview from the Naudet brothers documentary.
It was like the first thing that was, there was nobody there. Where the fuck, what do we do? We made it outside, we made it about a block.
We made it at least two blocks, and we started running. Floor by floor, instead of popping out.
It was if they had detonated.
Detonated.
If they were planned to take down a building. Boom, 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 boom.
All the way down. I was watching it and running. Just ran up West Street. And then you just sort of, this cloud of shit chasing you down.
Couldn't outrun it.
West Street. Couldn't outrun it.
In these interviews, numerous members of Engine 7 described explosions preceding the collapses, not to mention the damage to the lobby of the North Tower.
I heard a loud boom. And my first thing, I was right at the desk there, on the left-hand side when you come into Tower 1. And I walked out, I didn't go out, I walked to where all the doorway was, the glass was broken, and I looked out, and I seen in the building across the street, I seen the shadow coming, I seen just the shadow in the building across the street coming down.
I wasn't expecting to see the damage that I saw in the lobby, and the people, the bodies, the burnt people, the injured people. I really wasn't prepared for that.
The lobby is about 6 stories high, and the lobby looked as though a bomb had exploded there. All the glass was taken out. There were 10-foot by 10-foot marble panels that were once walls. They were loose from the wall of the Trade Center.
I went around by the freight elevator, and I could see it was just blown. It was just a giant shaft. And at that time, we heard a huge explosion. And we immediately dove for the stairs. Get back into the stairs. Let's get back into the stairs, because I had seen what happened in the lobby with the elevator being blown out. I said, if there's another explosion. What I feared, I never in a million years feared those buildings coming down. Never. I did fear secondary explosion, or possibly a second plane.
For more than a year, the Port Authority blocked the release of a tape of firefighters' transmissions from the World Trade Center on 9/11. In November 2002, the tape was finally released to the New York Times and other news outlets. Why did it take so long to get the tape released?
I got an eyewitness who said there was an explosion on floor 7-8. 7-8. We've just had another explosion. Warren Street because of the secondary explosion. We've got numerous people covered with dust from the secondary explosion. And we got another explosion on the tower, 1013. 1013 Avenue has had a major explosion and what appears to be a complete collapse surrounding the entire area. Who's involved in the secondary explosion at Tower 1K? I've got 5 patients.
Chief Palmer had reached the fire on the 78th floor of the South Tower and devised a plan to put it out.
We got 2 isolated pockets of fire. We should be able to knock it down with 2 lines. They know that. 78th floor, numerous 1045 call horns.
If the 78th floor was a raging inferno like the government would have us believe, then Palmer wouldn't have gotten as far as he did, and certainly wouldn't have been able to put it out. On August 12, 2005, an additional 15 hours of radio transmissions and transcripts of interviews with firefighters was finally released to the public. Firefighters described 2 events consistent with a controlled demolition: bright flashes from inside the building and a number of crackling sounds before the buildings collapsed. Do you still think that jet fuel brought down the World Trade Center? In all the videos of the collapses, explosions can be seen bursting from the building 20 to 30 stories below the demolition wave. Here, 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 and here. You're probably asking, if there were bombs in the building, how would they get in there without anyone noticing? Daria Cord, a guard in the North Tower, told Newsday that security detail was working 12-hour shifts for 2 weeks before 9/11, but on Thursday the 6th, bomb-sniffing dogs were abruptly removed from the building. So who authorized all this? President Bush's brother, Marvin, was board of directors at Securicom from 1993 until fiscal year 2000. Securicom, now known as Stratosec, is an electronic security company backed by Kuwait American Corporation, which provided security for United Airlines, Dulles International Airport, and from the early 1990s up to the day of 9/11, the World Trade Center. Marvin is also the former director at HCC Insurance Holdings, which insured parts of the World Trade Center on 9/11. More information on this was supposed to be disclosed and never was. To date, the SEC has not revealed what they have learned. If only we could examine the debris from the World Trade Center and figure out what happened. Unfortunately, Mayor Giuliani began shipping the remains off to recycling yards overseas before investigators could even examine it. Not even FEMA was allowed into Ground Zero. Essentially, they blocked off a crime scene and destroyed all the evidence. Guess who was allowed into the site? Controlled Demolition, who was also responsible for cleaning up after the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995. Regardless, I think what happened to the World Trade Center is simple enough. It was brought down in a carefully planned, controlled demolition. It was a psychological attack on the American people, and it was pulled off with military precision. "10:06 a.m., Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Flight 93 was en route from New Jersey to California with 45 passengers, a 19% occupancy rate, when it went off course at 8:56 over Cleveland, Ohio. According to the official story, Flight 93 was headed for the White House when it was overpowered by a group of passengers and crashed in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Out of all of the events of 9/11, the one that has caused the most confusion is Flight 93. It was shot down, it wasn't shot down. However, evidence suggests that perhaps Flight 93 was nowhere near Shanksville.
I want to get quickly to Chris Kanicki. He's a photographer with the Pittsburgh affiliate of Fox affiliate. He was back there just a couple of minutes ago. And Chris, I've seen the pictures. It looks like there's nothing there except for a hole in the ground.
Basically, that's right. The only thing you could see from where we were was a big gouge in the earth and some broken trees. We could see some people walking around in the area, but from where we could see, there wasn't much left.
Any large pieces of debris at all?
No, there was nothing that you could distinguish that a plane had crashed there.
Smoke, fire?
Nothing. It was absolutely quiet. It was actually very quiet. Nothing going on down there, no smoke, no fire. Just a couple of people walking around. They look like part of the NTSB crew walking around looking at the pieces.
How big would you say that hole was?
From my estimates, I would guess it was probably about 20 to 15 feet. long and probably about 10 feet long or 10 feet wide.
What could you see on the ground, if anything, other than dirt and ash? And
You couldn't see anything. You could just see dirt, ash, and people walking around, broken trees.
You're more familiar with this.
Wally Miller, a Somerset County coroner, told the Houston Chronicle, "It looked like somebody just dropped a bunch of metal out of the sky." In the Washington Post, "It looked like someone took a scrap truck, dug a 10-foot ditch, and dumped trash into it." And as for the passengers, "I stopped being coroner after about 20 minutes because there were no bodies there." In the Pittsburgh Review, "I have not, to this day, seen a single drop of blood. Not a drop." It would seem that, on one day, for the second time in history, an entire plane, along with its passengers, disappeared upon impact. So if Flight 93 didn't go down in Shanksville, then where? You ready for this? Cleveland. At 11:43 on September 11th, WCPO, a local TV station in Cincinnati, Ohio, reported that 2 planes landed at Cleveland Hopkins Airport due to a bomb threat. United Airlines identified one of the planes as Flight 93. Are you confused? Well, it gets better. Check it out. At approximately 10 a.m., Cleveland Hopkins Airport was evacuated amidst rumors that a hijacked plane was going to land. Passengers had to leave, but couldn't drive. They had to walk or hitchhike. Buses weren't allowed to leave. People were sent home. According to Associated Press and local Ohio papers, one plane landed at approximately 10:45. But Delta Airlines confirmed that their plane, Delta 1989, landed in Cleveland at 10:10. Therefore, Flight 93 landed at Cleveland at approximately 10:45. Authorities searched Delta 1989 for over 2 hours, and passengers were questioned individually. The plane dealer reported that the plane was evacuated at 12:30. But the Akron Beacon reports that a plane was evacuated at 11:15, which would make that Flight 93. Mayor White reported that the plane had 200 passengers. But a passenger from Delta 1989 described 60 or so passengers. So at 11:15, 200 or so passengers were released from Flight 93. The passenger from Delta 1989 states that she was taken into FAA headquarters. But other reports say that passengers were brought into the NASA Glenn Research Center, located near the west end of the airport, which had already been evacuated. So, to sum up, Delta 1989 landed at 10:10, was evacuated at 12:30, almost 2.5 hours later, and 69 passengers were taken to FAA headquarters. Flight 93 landed at 10:45 and evacuated within a half hour. 200 or so passengers quickly taken to an empty NASA research center. Why did it take 140 minutes to evacuate 69 passengers when 200 were evacuated in a half hour? We can assume that the passengers from Delta 1989 are safe somewhere. The question remains, what happened to the 200 or so passengers from Flight 93? It's interesting to note that the combined total of all the passengers from all 4 flights is 198, or 243, depending on who you ask. We may never know what really happened to Flight 93, but we do know what didn't happen. Whenever this evidence is presented to people, you'll usually get one of many different questions. The first one being, if different planes were used, what happened to the original ones? Unfortunately, there is no way to know what really happened. But if we could examine the black boxes from the planes that were used, we could prove that they weren't the original flights. A commercial plane carries 2 different black boxes. Each black box carries one of 2 different recorders, a cockpit voice recorder and a flight data recorder. The cockpit voice recorder records sounds from inside the cockpit, including engine noise, stall warnings, and other sounds of interest. Communications between air traffic control, weather briefings, and conversations between pilots and crew are also recorded. The flight data recorder records at least 28 different parameters such as time, altitude, speed, and heading. Some also record more than 300 other in-flight characteristics, anything from autopilot to smoke alarms. The recorders themselves are made from the most impervious metals known to man, and the information is recorded along with date and time and spooled into a continuous roll. Any damage that is done to the roll is done to the outside, as opposed to the inside where the data is. The 9/11 Commission says the CVRs and FDRs from American 11 and United 175 were not found. Yet, the FBI claims to have found the passport of Saddam al-Sakami, which managed to fly out of his pocket, through the explosion, and onto the streets of Manhattan below. So, 4 different black boxes, made from the most resilient materials known to man, were destroyed. Yet, a passport, made from a fragile material known as paper, managed to survive? Who writes this stuff? Ted Lepatkowitz, spokesman for the National Transportation Safety Board, told CBS News that it's extremely rare that we don't get the recorders back. I can't recall another domestic case in which we did not recover the recorders. Turns out Ted's right. Nicholas DeMasi, a firefighter who helped the recovery efforts, claims in the book Behind the Scenes, Ground Zero, "At one point, I was assigned to take federal agents around the site to search for the black boxes from the planes. There were a total of 4 black boxes. We found 3. I guess it all comes down to who you'd rather believe." FBI Director Robert Mueller said Flight 77's data recorder provided altitude, speed, headings, and other information, but the voice recorder contained nothing useful. And Donald Rumsfeld said the data on the cockpit voice recorder was unrecoverable. As for Flight 93, it was the only flight where the cockpit voice recorder was recovered. It was played for the families in April 2002, but not before they signed an agreement saying that they wouldn't talk about it. They couldn't even take notes. And for some reason, the last 3 minutes of the tape was unaccounted for. The FBI had no explanation for the discrepancy. Why would the 9/11 Commission tell us Flight 11 and 175's recorders weren't found? Why would Robert Mueller tell us that there's nothing interesting on Flight 77's? What's on the last 3 minutes of Flight 93's cockpit voice recorder? These are vital questions that need to be answered. And according to the FAA, both N591UA and N612UA, Flights 93 and 175, are still valid. But Flights 11 and 77 are listed as destroyed. Not to mention that they were not even scheduled to fly on September 11th. Next, what about the cell phone calls? For starters, the calls themselves are extremely peculiar. Most of them are only a couple sentences long before the callers end the conversation, only to call back later. Flight attendant Betty Ong allegedly placed a call from Flight 11. According to the 9/11 Commission, although the conversation lasted 23 minutes, only 4.5 minutes was recorded.
I can hear you.
Sure. What is your name?
Okay, my name is Betty Ong. I'm number 3 on Flight 11.
Okay.
And the cockpit is not answering their phones. And there's somebody stabbed in business class, and we can't breathe in business class. Somebody's got mace or something. Okay, our number 1 got stabbed. Our purser is stabbed. Nobody knows who stabbed who, and we can't even get up to business class right now because nobody can breathe. Our number 1 is stabbed right now.
Okay.
And our number 5, our first class passengers, our first class galley flight attendant and our purser has been stabbed. And we can't get the cockpit. The door won't open.
Does Miss Ong sound like a woman on a hijacked plane who just saw 3 people murdered? Why is nobody in the background screaming? Flight attendant Madeline Sweeney allegedly talked with her ground manager Michael Woodward for 25 minutes. She describes 4 hijackers. The FBI says there were 5. She says the hijackers were in rows 9 and 10. The FAA says they were all in row 8. A man claiming to be Mark Bingham called his mother Alice, who is visiting his sister-in-law. The caller says, "Mom, this is Mark Bingham. When was the last time you called your mother and used your full name? I just want to tell you that I love you. I'm on a flight from Newark to San Francisco, and there are 3 guys on board, and they have taken over the plane, and they say they have a bomb. I'm calling you from the airphone." And then, "You believe me, don't you, Mom?" "Yes, Mark, I believe you. Who are these guys?" Then he was interrupted by someone who was speaking in a low-toned male voice, speaking what sounded like English. After 30 seconds of muffled sounds, the caller repeats, "I'm calling you with an airphone." His mother asks him again, "Who are these guys?" After another pause, he returns and asks again, "You believe me, don't you, Mom?" There was another pause, and the phone just trailed off. But to be honest, none of that matters. Why? Because none of these calls could have possibly taken place. Key Dudney of Physics911.net conducted some research of his own. In an experiment called Project Achilles, he took a series of cell phones onto a Cessna 172 and flew up to 8,000 feet. At 4,000 feet, he had a 0.4 success rate. At 8,000 feet, he had a 0.1 success rate. For 32,000 feet, cruising altitude for a commercial airliner, he calculated a 0.006 success rate, less than 1 in 100th of a chance. Don't believe me? Even American Airlines has put their foot in the government's mouth. On July 15, 2004, passengers aboard a commercial American Airlines flight were able to send and receive calls from their cell phones as if they were on the ground, thanks to a cell station that was installed into the plane. It worked great. I called the office, I called my wife, I called a friend in Paris. They all heard me great, and I could hear them loud and clear. Why would Calcom and American Airlines spend thousands of dollars on this technology in 2004 when cell phones worked so well on September 11, 2001? The cell phone calls were fake. No question about it. So how is it possible to fake a person's voice? In 1999, the Los Alamos Laboratory in New Mexico revealed their voice morphing technology. General Carl W. Steiner, the former Commander-in-Chief of United States Special Operations, declared on tape, "Gentlemen, we have called you together to inform you that we are going to overthrow the United States government." Another example was Colin Powell saying, "I am being treated well by my captors." With just a 10-minute recording of somebody's voice, they were able, in almost real time, to clone someone's speech. Steiner was so impressed, he asked for a copy. So what about the hijackers? On September 14, 2001, the Department of Defense released the names of the alleged 19 hijackers. But on September 23rd, the BBC reported that Walid al-Shari was alive and well in Casablanca, Morocco. They also tracked down Abdulaziz al-Amari, who was an engineer with Saudi Telecoms and lost his passport while studying in Denver. In the same article, FBI Director Robert Mueller admitted that the identity of several of the hijackers is in doubt. So how many hijackers turned up alive? At least 9 of them. Wael M. al-Shari is alive and well. Mohand al-Shari is alive in Saudi Arabia. Khaled al-Madar is a computer programmer in Mecca. Salem al-Hazmi works at a chemical plant in Yanbo, Saudi Arabia. Saeed al-Ghamdi is training to be a pilot in Tunis. Ahmed al-Nami is an administrative supervisor for Saudi Airlines. We already covered Walid and Abdulaziz. And last but not least, Mohammed Atta's father claimed to receive a phone call from his son on September 12th. On September 20th and 27th, Mueller admitted on CNN that there is no legal proof to prove the identities of the hijackers. And now for the last question of all. Why would our government do such a thing? I hope you're sitting down. First, we have Larry Silverstein, the man who purchased the World Trade Center in July 2001. After September 11th, Silverstein demanded $7.2 billion from his insurers, claiming that each plane counted as a separate act of terrorism. However, on December 6th, 2004, the courts only reward him with $2.2 billion. Then we have the put options that were placed on United Airlines, American Airlines, and Boeing. According to the San Francisco Chronicle, more than $2.5 million has remained unclaimed. As for 9/11 itself, Reuters reported that Comvar, a German computer company, is responsible for helping companies and accountants in New York restore their data from over 400 hard drives that were recovered from the World Trade Center's rubble. Convar recovered information from 32 different computers that suggested insider trading took place on 9/11. Richard Wagner, an expert at Convar. There is a suspicion that some people had advanced knowledge of the approximate time of the plane crashes in order to move out amounts exceeding $100 million. They thought that the records of their transactions could not be traced after the mainframes were destroyed. After their analysis, Convar handed the results over to the FBI. Although the FBI was legally bound to investigate who was responsible, to date they have done no such thing. One of the world's largest gold depositories was stored underneath the World Trade Center. In 1993, the value of the gold was estimated at $1 billion, rumored to be owned by Kuwaiti interests. When the World Trade Center was destroyed, the amount of gold far exceeded the 1993 levels. The gold was finally recovered in its entirety in late 2001. Or was it? On November 1st, 2001, the Times Online reported that a large amount of gold was discovered in the wreckage of the World Trade Center. Mayor Rudolph Giuliani announced that more than $230 million was recovered from Ground Zero. However, the COMEX Metals Trading Division was storing gold bars for the Bank of Nova Scotia, Chase Manhattan Bank, the Bank of New York and Hong Kong, and Shanghai Banking, totaling $950 million. And that's just one company. Rumor has it that over $160 billion in gold was stored in the World Trade Center. So where did all the gold go? Remember the gold that was found in November 2001? Reuters reported that it was discovered in the back of a 10-wheel truck, along with several cars, in a delivery tunnel underneath World Trade Center 5. No bodies were recovered. As workers got closer to the gold, authorities began restricting access to Ground Zero, joined by FBI and Secret Service agents. One worker, directed away from the tunnel, told a reporter, "If I tried to go down there, they would have shot me." Heavy machinery operators and others worked under the watchful eye of more than 100 armed officers. So, let me get this straight. Gold from World Trade Center 4 was found underneath World Trade Center 5 in an empty delivery truck with an empty escort of cars. I think it's safe to say that they were running away from the South Tower. The question is, how did they know to flee from their stash when not even the firefighters inside the South Tower expected it to collapse? $167 billion in gold. $200 million is found. And that's just the money. After September 11th, President Bush had and continues to have the power to do and say whatever he wants, all under the pretext of 9/11. The Patriot Act. The Department of Homeland Security. Afghanistan. Iraq.
Got him. Good. Second one. Hit the other one.
It's time for America to accept 9/11 for what it was. A lie which killed thousands of people, only in turn killing hundreds of thousands more to make billions upon trillions of dollars. Are you angry yet? You should be. Every single attempt to investigate and uncover the truth behind 9/11 has been blackballed, ridiculed, and harassed by both the government and media alike. I'll say it again. Why are they hiding?
The terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001 changed America forever, rocking the country to its very foundations. Never before had we felt so vulnerable, so exposed to the threat of violence from foreign actors. Unlike the bombing of Pearl Harbor during the Second World War, this attack came not from an official government, but from individuals, fanatics, who would listen to neither reason nor diplomacy. If the goal of terrorism is to provoke fear, then the Taliban certainly succeeded. Never has the nation been more united than in the days and the weeks following September 11th. United in anger, grief, and an overwhelming need to feel safe again. Leave it to the government to exploit those feelings to seize a sweeping new set of powers.
States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil.
On October 26, 2001, President George W. Bush signed the Patriot Act into law. It was a hastily drafted law ostensibly designed to fight global terrorism and make it impossible for something like September 11 to happen again. This is what we're told anyways.
Will help law enforcement to identify to dismantle, to disrupt, and to punish terrorists before they strike.
And in the fevered haze of our national panic, most of us were eager to believe it. The bill passed the Senate with only a single no vote from Democrat Russ Feingold.
We will lose that war without firing a shot if we sacrifice the liberties of the American people.
What many were too desperate to notice at the time was that the law severely weakened the constitutional protections on Americans' privacy and due process. Among other things, the Patriot Act allows the government to conduct searches without warrants or probable cause, to secretly surveil a wide variety of electronic communications, and to indefinitely detain immigrants without trial. It also greatly expanded the range of activities that could legally be classified as terrorism. While most Americans in 2001 were focused on terrorist threats from the Middle East, a major section of the Patriot Act is devoted to redefining domestic terrorism. Section 802 of the law specifies that domestic terrorism includes actions designed to change government policy through intimidation or coercion, as long as such actions can be interpreted as violating local laws and posing a danger to human life. In practice, this definition reclassifies a great deal of political activism as domestic terrorism. Groups engaging in a large scale of protests and civil disobedience can easily run afoul of this language depending on who is interpreting what constitutes danger. The ACLU points out that Greenpeace and other environmentalist groups regularly engage in protests that the Justice Department could define as terrorism if it wanted to. Of course, the vagueness of the wording means that the Attorney General can pick and choose who to go after, applying the law unevenly for political or ideological purposes. Most recently, we saw this play out with respect to parents protesting at school board meetings, objecting to the use of sexually explicit or ideologically slanted material in the classroom.
I want her to hear from me as a parent what her gender identity means to her and to our family.
Rather than hear those concerns out, the National School Boards Association asked Attorney General Merrick Garland to prosecute concerned parents under the domestic terrorist provisions of the Patriot Act. By labeling protesters as terrorists, the Justice Department is authorized to seize all of their assets without due process, including their houses, cars, and bank accounts. It's hard to see how what these parents are asking for poses any danger at all, but when due process is removed, it's easy for the government to contrive a justification for its actions, however flimsy. Like so many government policies, the Patriot Act is a shell game, promising to protect us from our enemies abroad, but instead being turned inward to persecute patriotic Americans, and to establish a police state unable to be challenged by direct citizen action. The right to protest the government is fundamental to a free society, but under the Patriot Act, almost any effective demonstration can be silenced from the top down. This is not a partisan issue. Whether you're a fan of Black Lives Matter or the Proud Boys, it's likely that sooner or later something you think is vital to the survival of our democracy will be shut down by a corrupt administration. As long as the Patriot Act remains law, the only voice we have is the one those in power decide to permit us.
Just 2 hours ago, Allied air forces began an attack on military targets in Iraq and Kuwait. These attacks continue as I speak. Ground forces are not engaged. This conflict started August 2nd when the dictator of Iraq invaded a small and helpless neighbor. Kuwait, a member of the Arab League and a member of the United Nations, was crushed. Its people brutalized. 5 months ago, Saddam Hussein started this cruel war against Kuwait. Tonight, the battle has been joined. This military action, taken in accord with United Nations resolutions and with the consent of the United States Congress, follows months of constant and virtually endless diplomatic activity on the part of the United Nations, the United States, and many, many other countries. Arab leaders sought what became known as an Arab solution, only to conclude that Saddam Hussein was unwilling to leave Kuwait. Others traveled to Baghdad in a variety of efforts to restore peace and justice. Our Secretary of State, James Baker, held an historic meeting in Geneva, only to be totally rebuffed. This past weekend, in a last-ditch effort, the Secretary General of the United Nations went to the Middle East with peace in his heart, his second such mission, and he came back from Baghdad with no progress at all in getting Saddam Hussein to withdraw from Kuwait. Now, the 28 countries with forces in the Gulf area have exhausted all reasonable efforts to reach a peaceful resolution. Have no choice but to drive Saddam from Kuwait by force. We will not fail. As I report to you, air attacks are underway against military targets in Iraq. We are determined to knock out Saddam Hussein's nuclear bomb potential. We will also destroy his chemical weapons facilities. Much of Saddam's artillery and tanks will be destroyed. Our operations are designed to best protect the lives of all the coalition forces by targeting Saddam's vast military arsenal. Initial reports from General Schwarzkopf are that our operations are proceeding according to plan. Our objectives are clear. Saddam Hussein's forces will leave Kuwait. The legitimate government of Kuwait will be restored to its rightful place, and Kuwait will once again be free. Iraq will eventually comply with all relevant United Nations resolutions, and then, when peace is restored, it is our hope that Iraq will live as a peaceful and cooperative member of the family of nations, thus enhancing the security and stability of the Gulf. Some may ask, why act now? Why not wait? The answer is clear. The world could wait no longer. Sanctions, though having some effect, showed no signs of accomplishing their objective. Sanctions were tried for well over 5 months, and we and our allies concluded that sanctions alone would not force Saddam from Kuwait. While the world waited, Saddam Hussein systematically raped, pillaged, and plundered a tiny nation, no threat to his own. He subjected the people of Kuwait to unspeakable atrocities, and among those maimed and murdered, innocent children. While the world waited, Saddam sought to add to the chemical weapons arsenal he now possesses an infinitely more dangerous weapon of mass destruction, a nuclear weapon. And while the world waited, while the world talked peace and withdrawal, Saddam Hussein dug in and moved massive forces into Kuwait. While the world waited, while Saddam stalled, more damage was being done to the fragile economies of the Third World, the emerging democracies of Eastern Europe, to the entire world, including to our own economy. The United States, together with the United Nations, exhausted every means at our disposal to bring this crisis to a peaceful end. However, Saddam clearly felt that by stalling and threatening and defying the United Nations, he could weaken the forces arrayed against him. While the world waited, Saddam Hussein met every overture of peace with open contempt. While the world prayed for peace, Saddam prepared for war. I had hoped that when the United States Congress, in historic debate, took its resolute action, Saddam would realize he could not prevail and would move out of Kuwait in accord with the United Nations resolutions. He did not do that. Instead, he remained intransigent, certain that time was on his side. Saddam was warned over and over again to comply with the will of the United Nations, leave Kuwait or be driven out. Saddam has arrogantly rejected all warnings. Instead, he tried to make this a dispute between Iraq and the United States of America. Well, he failed. Tonight, 28 nations, Countries from 5 continents, Europe and Asia, Africa and the Arab League, have forces in the Gulf area standing shoulder to shoulder against Saddam Hussein. These countries had hoped the use of force could be avoided. Regrettably, we now believe that only force will make him leave. Prior to ordering our forces into battle, I instructed our military commanders to take every necessary step to prevail as quickly as possible and with the greatest degree of protection possible for American and Allied servicemen and women. I've told the American people before that this will not be another Vietnam. And I repeat this here tonight. Our troops will have the best possible support in the entire world, and they will not be asked to fight with one hand tied behind their back. I'm hopeful that this fighting will not go on for long, and that casualties will be held to an absolute minimum. This is an historic moment. We have in this past year made great progress in ending the long era of conflict and Cold War. We have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order, a world where the rule of law, not the law of the jungle, governs the conduct of nations. When we are successful, and we will be, we have a real chance at this new world order, an order in which a credible United Nations can use its peacekeeping role to fulfill the promise and vision of the UN's founders. We have no argument with the people of Iraq. Indeed, for the innocents caught in this conflict, I pray for their safety. Our goal is not the conquest of Iraq. It is the liberation of Kuwait. It is my hope that somehow the Iraqi people can, even now, convince their dictator that he must lay down his arms, leave Kuwait, and let Iraq itself rejoin the family of peace-loving nations. Thomas Paine wrote many years ago, "These are the times that try men's souls." Those well-known words are so very true today. But even as planes of the multinational forces attack Iraq, I prefer to think of peace, not war. I am convinced not only that we will prevail, but that out of the horror of combat will come the recognition that no nation can stand against a world united. No nation will be permitted to brutally assault its neighbor. No president can easily commit our sons and daughters to war. They are the nation's finest. Ours is an all-volunteer force, magnificently trained, highly motivated. The troops know why they're there, and listen to what they say, for they've said it better than any president or prime minister ever could. Listen to Hollywood Huddleston, Marine Lance Corporal. He says, "Let's free these people so we can go home and be free again." He's right. The terrible crimes and tortures committed by Saddam's henchmen against the innocent people of Kuwait are an affront to mankind and a challenge to the freedom of all. Listen to one of our great officers out there, Marine Lieutenant General Walter Boomer. He said, "There are things worth fighting for. A world in which brutality and lawlessness are allowed to go unchecked isn't the kind of world we're going to want to live in." Listen to Master Sergeant J.P. Kendall of the 82nd Airborne. "We're here for more than just the price of a gallon of gas. What we're doing is going to chart the future of the world for the next 100 years. It's better to deal with this guy now than 5 years from now." And finally, we should all sit up and listen to Jackie Jones, an Army lieutenant, when she says, if we let him get away with this, who knows what's going to be next? I've called upon Hollywood and Walter and JP and Jackie and all their courageous comrades in arms to do what must be done. Tonight, America and the world are deeply, deeply grateful to them and to their families. And let me say to everyone listening or watching tonight, when the troops we've sent in finish their work, I'm determined to bring them home as soon as possible. Tonight, as our forces fight, they and their families are in our prayers. May God bless each and every one of them and the coalition forces at our side in the Gulf, and may He continue to bless our nation, the United States of America.
Former United States President George H.W. Bush died on November 30th, 2018. And while leading Democrats joined the GOP in celebrating the Republican leader as a hero, honoring him in a bipartisan ceremony, the real Bush left behind a murderous legacy full of war crimes across the planet. The corporate media lionized Bush, a former oil tycoon and director of the CIA, as a statesman who committed his life to his country. But Bush's patriotism was not rooted in devotion to the average working class American people. Instead, he was an elite custodian of capitalism and empire. From Iraq to Panama, George H.W. Bush was responsible for countless deaths. And far from being the moderate voice of reason he is now being presented as in the era of Trumpism, Bush paved the way for right-wing extremists to take control of the U.S. empire he so carefully preserved. If one had to succinctly summarize George H.W. Bush in a single moment, it would be on the eve of his presidency in 1988. On July 3rd of that year, the U.S. government shot down an Iranian civilian plane, killing all 290 passengers on board, including 66 children. The United States adamantly refused to apologize for this horrific atrocity. Bush was then vice president under Ronald Reagan and was in the middle of his own campaign for president. At a GOP event just a month later, in August, Bush indirectly responded to the U.S. massacre of Iranian civilians with the following infamous words.
I'll never apologize for the United States of America. Ever. I don't care what the facts are.
This lone quote says so much about the 41st U.S. president. It is a concise representation of the imperial hubris and chauvinism that Bush was the physical embodiment of. He refused to apologize for the crimes of the U.S. empire and did not give a damn about the facts. George H.W. Bush's family, life, and world were the textbook representation of the American ruling class, combining together the CIA, the oil industry, elite Ivy League universities, and even Nazi Germany. Bush was born in 1924 into an elite capitalist family. His grandfather, Samuel Bush, was a corporate steel and railroad executive who oversaw U.S. government contracts with weapons corporations during World War I. H.W.'s father, Prescott Bush, was an even more notorious figure. In 1918, as a member of Yale University's elite secret society Skull and Bones, Prescott and his peers dug up the grave of former Native American leader Geronimo and stole his skull. Prescott Bush then went on to become a bank executive on Wall Street. And during the Holocaust, the Bush family patriarch even profited from the genocidal Hitler regime. As the newspaper The Guardian reported in 2004, even after America had entered the war and when there was already significant information about the Nazis' plans and policies, he worked for and profited from companies closely involved with the very German businesses that financed Hitler's rise to power. It has also been suggested that the money he made from these dealings helped to establish the Bush family fortune and set up its political dynasty. Although the assets of Prescott Bush's company were seized by the U.S. government in 1942 under the Trading with the Enemy Act, this did not stop him from pursuing a political career. A decade later, in 1952, Bush was elected to the U.S. Senate, representing Connecticut. George H.W. Bush followed in the footsteps of his father. He went to Yale University and was also a member of the elite secret society Skull and Bones. After graduation, Bush moved to Texas and entered the oil industry. In 1953, he co-founded the Zapata Petroleum Corporation and quickly became a millionaire. In the early 1960s, before Bush officially entered politics, he also secretly started to work with the CIA. Journalist Joseph McBride noted, quote, Bush started working for the agency in 1960 or 1961, using his oil business as a cover for clandestine activities. After over a decade of building up his fortune in the oil industry, Bush then moved on to politics. He was elected to the House of Representatives in 1966, representing Texas. But that was just the beginning. Bush then became U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations and subsequently chairman of the Republican National Committee. And then in 1976, Bush was appointed Director of Central Intelligence. After secretly working with the CIA for over a decade, Bush, a staunchly conservative Cold Warrior, was now the chief of it. Historian Greg Grandin wrote, quote, Bush helmed the CIA when it was working closely with Latin American death squads grouped under Operation Condor. This was the height of the Cold War, and after the CIA had already violently overthrown numerous democratically elected governments throughout the global South, from Iran to Guatemala to Chile, the U.S. continued supporting far-right military dictatorships and death squads throughout Latin America. This was also at a time when Bush was developing deeper ties to Saudi Arabia, one of the world's largest oil producers and a key U.S. ally in the Cold War. With U.S. backing, the Saudi monarchy supported right-wing Islamist groups, many of which were extremists, to undermine secular socialist and communist forces in the Middle East. And through both oil and politics, Bush and his family maintained close links to Saudi elites, including the powerful bin Laden family. Historian Greg Grandin likewise pointed out that it was Bush who helped facilitate Ronald Reagan's escalation of the Cold War through the infamous Iran-Contra scandal. Bush served as vice president under President Reagan during this scandal, in which the Republican administration sold weapons to Iran in order to fund far-right Contra death squads in Nicaragua. When Bush succeeded Reagan as the 41st president, he used his authority to pardon the conspirators involved in the Iran-Contra scandal, thereby preventing an investigation into his own criminal activity. Many observers have noted that by doing this, George H.W. Bush helped set the precedent that Donald Trump would later exploit as president. But this paled in comparison to Bush's most egregious crimes. In 1989, the administration of the newly inaugurated President Bush invaded the tiny Central American nation of Panama in order to oust dictator Manuel Noriega, who had himself been a longtime CIA asset, who for years worked closely with the United States, helping it to fund right-wing death squads while he was trafficking drugs. The U.S. brutally bombed Panama, burning down thousands of homes, leading to the nickname Little Hiroshima. Historian Greg Grandin noted that the bodies of dead Panamanians were shoveled into mass graves. But Bush's bloodiest atrocities were yet to come. In August 1990, Iraq militarily occupied and annexed its southern neighbor Kuwait. The Bush administration wanted a war in response, and in order to sell this war, it spread blatant lies. In October 1990, a 15-year-old Kuwaiti girl testified before the U.S. Congressional Human Rights Caucus and claimed,
"While I was there, I saw the Iraqi soldiers come into the hospital with guns. They took the babies out of the incubators, and left the children to die on the floor." It was horrifying.
human rights organizations like Amnesty International obediently echoed this myth, and George H.W. Bush used it to justify a war on Iraq.
They had kids in incubators, and they were thrown out of the incubators so that Kuwait could be systematically dismantled.
It was only after this war, in 1992, that it was revealed that this 15-year-old girl was actually the daughter of Kuwait's ambassador to the U.S., and that the lies she spread had been orchestrated by a PR firm on behalf of the Kuwaiti monarchy. But remember, Bush had declared just a few years ago that he didn't care what the facts are. In 1991, the 41st U.S. president launched a war on Iraq, and it was extremely brutal. Under Bush's leadership, the U.S. military deliberately targeted civilian infrastructure, devastating the country. Just weeks after the end of the war, the United Nations published a survey analyzing the civilian damage done by U.S. bombing. The UN found that Iraq was, quote, near apocalyptic, that it had been bombed back, quote, to a pre-industrial age, and that the country was on the verge of a, quote, epidemic and famine. The U.S. military also used depleted uranium weapons in Iraq, leading to birth defects, high cancer rates, and environmental damage that Iraqis are still suffering from to this day. Even the Washington Post, which supported the war, acknowledged 4 months after it that the U.S. and its allies, quote, sought to achieve some of their military objectives in the Persian Gulf War by disabling Iraqi society at large. And the U.S., quote, deliberately did great harm to Iraq's ability to support itself as an industrial society. Precision-guided weapons were used to specifically target electrical plants, oil refineries, and the transportation grid. The U.S. destroyed more than 100 bridges, along with roads, railroads, factories, phone networks, and TV and radio stations. The Pentagon later admitted that it intentionally demolished Iraq's electricity infrastructure, reducing the country's power generation level after the war by 96%, knocking it back to the level that Iraq had in 1920. A lieutenant general told the Washington Post that the psychological impacts that average Iraqi citizens would suffer from after losing their electricity was a, quote, side benefit. One of the most extreme U.S. crimes was committed on February 13, 1991, when the military used laser-guided smart bombs to destroy a shelter full of civilians. 408 Iraqi civilians were massacred in this U.S. attack, and the Pentagon itself admitted that the Amaria shelter that it bombed was being used by civilians seeking protection. Even more blood-curdling was an atrocity that was so heinous it earned the name the Highway of Death. On February 26th and 27th, the U.S. and allies Britain, France, and Canada bombed Iraqi soldiers as they tried to flee Kuwait and return to Iraq. Thousands of fleeing Iraqis were massacred. There were even reportedly some civilians among the soldiers as they tried to flee, including foreign workers and Palestinians who were expelled by the Kuwaiti monarchy. They were all bombed to pieces. Thousands died. The exact number of victims is unknown. The aftermath of the Gulf War was beyond catastrophic. A Harvard public health team investigated and found that Iraq had acute malnutrition and epidemic levels of the preventable diseases cholera and typhoid. The Harvard team also estimated that at least 170,000 Iraqi children under age 5 would die in the year after the war due to the effects of the U.S. bombing. The Washington Post noted, quote, planners now say their intent was to destroy or damage valuable facilities that Baghdad could not repair without foreign assistance. The Bush administration deliberately made the lives of millions of Iraqis complete hell to try to force them into such desperation that they would overthrow their leader. And even when the 1991 Gulf War ended, the Bush 41 administration's war on Iraqi society continued. The U.S. used the United Nations Security Council to expand crippling sanctions on Iraq, which banned all trade with the country. These sanctions, which were further continued under subsequent President Bill Clinton, led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Iraqi children and other civilians. In response to these reports of mass civilian devastation from U.S. bombing, George H.W. Bush's Secretary of Defense, Dick Cheney, insisted that every target was, quote, perfectly legitimate. He declared, quote, if I had to do it over again, I would do exactly the same thing. Bush Sr.'s Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney would go on to become Bush Jr.'s vice president, and the brains behind George W. Bush's foreign policy and his own second war on Iraq a decade later. Moreover, H.W. Bush's chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Colin Powell, later served as W. Bush's Secretary of State. Given the overlap between Bush 41's administration and that of Bush 43, it is no surprise that Bush Jr. followed in his father's footsteps, launching another devastating war in the Middle East, which destabilized the region and led to more than 1 million deaths. These crimes fly directly in the face of the corporate media's portrayal of George H.W. Bush as a principled moderate, and expose the cynicism behind the attempts to distance him from the political horrors that followed. While Google made a doodle dedicated to H.W.'s passing, and while neoliberal centrist leaders of the Democratic Party tried to rehabilitate Bush as a resistance figure against Donald Trump, the reality is that he and the Bush family only helped set the stage for the rise of far-right Trumpism. Even the explicit racism and the dog-whistling to fascists and white supremacists that Donald Trump has weaponized is far from new. H.W. engaged in it as well. During his 1988 campaign for president, Bush and his supporters resorted to using racist undertones to attack his Democratic opponent, Michael Dukakis. Specifically, they exploited the case of Willie Horton, a black man who was imprisoned for murder and rape, but who escaped from prison after being temporarily released on a weekend furlough program in Massachusetts. Far-right writer Ann Coulter, a staunch Donald Trump supporter who regularly contributes to a white supremacist website, described the HW camp's racist exploitation of the Willie Horton scandal as, quote, Bush's finest 30 seconds. Journalist Russ Bellant, the author of the book Old Nazis, the New Right, and the Republican Party, also documented how former Nazi collaborators from Eastern Europe helped get Bush elected president. Fascist, staunch anti-communists who immigrated to the U.S. from socialist Eastern Bloc countries during the Cold War later took leadership positions in the Republican National Committee's ethnic outreach groups and strongly supported Bush. A lifelong Cold Warrior, Bush was also president when U.S.-backed counter-revolutions overthrew the Eastern Bloc in 1990 and 1991. He subsequently helped oversee brutal neoliberal capitalist reforms that were referred to as shock therapy, and that led to millions of unnecessary deaths in the former Soviet Union. Under Bush's leadership, the U.S. pressured these former socialist governments to engage in mass privatizations, selling off state-owned industries and assets for pennies on the dollar. This US-backed neoliberal shock therapy established the network of capitalist oligarchs who control Eastern Europe still today. This was just one of the many policies that George H.W. Bush oversaw that the world is still reeling from in 2018. It was not just war crimes and CIA spying, oil drilling, and racist dog whistling that defined Bush's life. In 1990, the 41st U.S. president heralded in what he proudly called a new world order. Capitalism had won the global war on socialism, and Bush was the leader of the only remaining superpower in the world. The United States of America was the global hegemon, and its military and corporations ruled all. American imperialism had triumphed and would spend the next 3 decades imposing the Washington Consensus on the planet. In this way, George H.W. Bush did much more than just pave the way for his son and eventually Donald Trump to take power. Even more importantly, as Bush stood there with the last Soviet premier Mikhail Gorbachev, Bush was being anointed king of the neoliberal era, the seeds of which had been planted by his predecessor Ronald Reagan. That neoliberal era died in 2016 with the election of Donald Trump the resurgence of far-right and fascist movements across the globe, and with a renewed socialist left and the implosion of the bipartisan centrist consensus. After his passing, Bush was commemorated as a skilled leader, and he was indeed skilled in the art of empire, warmongering, and reaction. Bush was the last competent manager of the American ruling class. He came from the elite, from the rich and the powerful, and he left them even richer on his deathbed. Bush was a lifelong custodian of U.S. imperialism and capitalism, and he served those systems well. He bears significant responsibility for ushering in the new world order that followed him, the one whose demons we're all grappling with today. Bush 41 supporters have tried to absolve him for the state of the country and the world that he left behind, but George H.W. Bush cannot be separated from it. After all, he refused to ever apologize for his country and cared little for inconvenient facts.
I'll never apologize for the United States of America. Ever. I don't care what the facts are.
Fellow citizens, at this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger. On my orders, coalition forces have begun striking selected targets of military importance to undermine Saddam Hussein's ability to wage war. These are opening stages of what will be a broad and concerted campaign. More than 35 countries are giving crucial support, from the use of naval and air bases to help with intelligence and logistics to the deployment of combat units. Every nation in this coalition has chosen to bear the duty and share the honor of serving in our common defense. To all the men and women of the United States Armed Forces now in the Middle East, the peace of a troubled world and the hopes of an oppressed people now depend on you. That trust is well placed. The enemies you confront will come to know your skill and bravery. The people you liberate will witness the honorable and decent spirit of the American military. In this conflict, America faces an enemy who has no regard for conventions of war or rules of morality. Saddam Hussein has placed Iraqi troops and equipment in civilian areas, attempting to use innocent men, women, and children as shields for his own military, a final atrocity against his people. I want Americans and all the world to know that coalition forces will make every effort to spare innocent civilians from harm. A campaign on the harsh terrain of a nation as large as California could be longer and more difficult than some predict. And helping Iraqis achieve a united, stable, and free country will require our sustained commitment. We come to Iraq with respect for its citizens, for their great civilization, and for the religious faiths they practice. We have no ambition in Iraq except to remove a threat and restore control of that country to its own people. I know that the families of our military are praying that all those who serve will return safely and soon. Millions of Americans are praying with you for the safety of your loved ones and for the protection of the innocent. For your sacrifice, you have the gratitude and respect of the American people. And you can know that our forces will be coming home as soon as their work is done. Our nation enters this conflict reluctantly, yet our purpose is sure. The people of the United States and our friends and allies will not live at the mercy of an outlaw regime that threatens the peace with weapons of mass murder. We will meet that threat now with our Army, Air Force, Navy, Coast Guard, and Marines, so that we do not have to meet it later with armies of firefighters and police and doctors on the streets of our cities. Now that conflict has come, the only way to limit its duration is to apply decisive force. And I assure you, this will not be a campaign of half measures, and we will accept no outcome but victory. My fellow citizens, the dangers to our country and the world will be overcome. We will pass through this time of peril and carry on the work of peace. We will defend our freedom. We will bring freedom to others, and we will prevail. May God bless our country and all who defend it.
Joining me is David Kaye. He's a professor of law at the University of California Irvine School of Law, also a former lawyer with the U.S. Department of State responsible for the application of the Geneva Conventions and other areas of international law. David, really great to have you here. My first thought was to do a segment based on some emails I had gotten about, 10 years after the Iraq War. Are statutes of limitations going to become a factor in thinking about possible war crimes charges against Bush administration officials? I'll put that question kind of on the back burner for now and first ask you about, if we are to talk about possible war crimes charges, what specifically would they be? In other words, when we get to the nitty-gritty, what types of things conceivably could Bush administration officials be charged with?
Sure. And thanks for having me, David. I'm happy to be here. There are a range of different claims that have been made against Bush administration officials over the years. And, it's complicated by a number of factors, including whether we go back to the very beginning of the post 9/11 period and ask whether we're actually in an armed conflict. There are quite a number of people out there who believe that we're not in an armed conflict. And in that case, war crimes simply do not apply. You can only commit a war crime in time of war. So there is a divide out there between those who believe we're in an armed conflict or not. But let's assume that we're in an armed conflict, and that is really the bipartisan belief in Washington, I believe. If we're in an armed conflict, then a number of different kinds of war crimes charges could be leveled or alleged against members of the Bush administration, whether we're talking about military or other agencies such as the CIA. And I think the one that we heard most about over the last 10 years has been related to torture. Torture is a war crime. It's a grave breach of the Geneva Conventions. It's a crime under the Convention Against Torture. And that's one area where there's significant information suggesting that torture was committed by U.S. officials, by U.S. contractors, was authorized by U.S. officials over the course of particularly the first several years after 9/11. And I think that would be the one that would probably would be at the highest profile, I would say. But of course, there are other kinds of war crimes that might be alleged. Those might have to do with death that resulted from poor treatment, from maltreatment at different sites that were run by U.S. officials, and so those kinds of allegations would amount to murder as a war crime. I want to just emphasize that even if we're not talking about war crimes, war crimes is in a way shorthand for bad acts that took place in the post 9/11 environment. War crimes are not the exclusive way of thinking about these. There's domestic law against torture under the Convention Against Torture and the Torture Victim Protection Act. There's obviously murder charges that can be brought under U.S. law, basic kind of federal tort kinds of issues. Sure. There's all sorts of allegations out there that could be lodged against U.S. officials, even before we get to the questions, as you suggested, about whether it's plausible to even think about these kinds of prosecutions or claims being brought.
So before we get into that, separate from the torture questions, as we get more and more information from individuals that were involved with the intelligence that was used, or lack of intelligence that was used to get us into the war with Iraq, we find out that there was a deliberate effort to manipulate that intelligence to give a particular idea. And Among those things are, for example, the claim that Saddam Hussein had and could have deployed weapons of mass destruction within a 45-minute window. Given that we know that that was a deliberate manipulation of intelligence to show something that was not true, is there anything along those lines that anybody could be charged with?
And that's a really good question. I wouldn't consider that under the umbrella of war crimes or crimes against humanity. And it'd be very, very difficult to identify any specific area of law where criminal charges could be brought for the actual resort to force in Iraq. And, you know, there is, you know, an emerging, I wouldn't say even consensus, but there's an emerging trend in international law to deal with the crime of aggression, which is separate from war crimes, crimes against humanity, or genocide, which are, you know, subject matter jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. One might consider aggression, which was prosecuted in Nuremberg, for example, to be another heading for prosecutions. But I find that, first of all, it's not something that will happen in the context of Iraq, particularly in the ICC, where there is no jurisdiction. But also because we don't have any firm rule of law in the United States that would govern that kind of prosecution. So that's sort of a long way of saying I don't see a mechanism for prosecution under the actual use of force, even if, as you mentioned, there are claims that we went into that conflict under false pretenses.
So let's touch on the statutes of limitation thing to kind of just get your thought on that. Is it true that as we have reached and passed the 10-year mark from the start of the Iraq War, is that significant in any way when it comes to the timing of possible war crimes, as hypothetical as they may be? What is the reality of statutes of limitations when it comes to these types of allegations?
Yeah, it's a good question. So first there's the law that exists on the books. And, you know, generally speaking, there's a statute of limitations that applies to claims under federal law. Typically, it's 5 years. In the case of torture, it's 8 years. I wouldn't count it from the moment of, you know, the invasion of Iraq.
Right. It would be from when those acts happened, right?
Exactly. So, you know, for whether we're talking about a prosecutor who might be investigating such claims, or an individual claimant who might be making claims under civil jurisdiction, right? A claim for as a tort, essentially. You know, you would go and count that from the time at which the injury occurred, at the time of the bad treatment. And so, you know, it's hard to determine when that might be, but regardless, if we're looking at torture and we're talking about an 8-year statute of limitations, we're either very close or beyond the period where there could be prosecutions or claims brought against individuals for that kind of treatment. So that's the law on the books.
We've been speaking with David Kay. He's a professor of law at the University of California Irvine School of Law, also a former lawyer with the U.S. Department of State. David, really great to have you on today. Thanks for your insights.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay in Washington. There have been many attempts over the last few years to prosecute former President Bush, Vice President Cheney, and other senior members of his administration for war crimes of various sorts. None of those until recently were successful. Well, one of those prosecutions has now ended up in a conviction, in absentia, of course, and that took place in Malaysia. Now joining us is one of the members of the prosecutorial team. This is Francis Boyle. He's a professor of law at the University of Illinois School of Law, where he currently teaches courses on public international law and international human rights. He was a part of the prosecution team, as I mentioned, that tried President Bush, former President Bush, former Vice President Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, the legal advisors in Malaysia, and were successful. As I said, thanks for joining us.
Well, Paul, thank you very much for having me on, and my best to your audience.
Thank you. So what were the charges, and tell us a bit about the process?
Well, the charges were twofold. First, torture, and then second, since torture in wartime constitutes war crimes, the second charge were war crimes. There was 4 days of hearings by the prosecution and the defense. And then on the end of the fifth day, the tribunal issued a unanimous judgment to the effect that Bush, Cheney, Rumsfeld, and 5 of their top lawyers advising them on this, including Bybee, Haynes, and Gonzalez Addington, were personally responsible for and guilty of torture and war crimes as defined by the Convention Against Torture, to which the United States government is a party, and the 4 Geneva Conventions of 1949, to which the United States government is a party as well.
Right. Now, under whose auspices was this process held? What kind of official status did it have?
The Kuala Lumpur War Crimes Tribunal Foundation is a private organization set up and chartered under Malaysian law. So it is a creature of Malaysian law.
And but most nonprofits and such can be registered with the government. But what I'm saying is it didn't have direct government endorsement of any sort, did it?
No, it was like a U.S. corporation being set up under U.S. corporation law, but it was not run by the government. Indeed, my guess is the current government in Malaysia probably found it to be somewhat embarrassing, since the current government in Malaysia is trying to get into good cahoots with the United States government. But I can't speak for them.
And was there a defense offered, and who offered it?
Yes, a defense team was appointed for them. It consisted of 4 or 5 Malaysian lawyers, and they did the best they could with a very difficult case, because effectively Bush, Cheney, and Rumsfeld repeatedly incriminated themselves publicly, both in their public statements and in their memoirs and otherwise in acts of torture. So it is hard to defend people who have already incriminated themselves, but the defense did try.
So what will be the effect of this? I understand you have a separate process going at the International Criminal Court. So how do these two relate to each other? And then also, how do you have something going at the International Criminal Court when the United States is not a signatory to it?
Well, that's correct. Over the years now, I've tried to get Bush indicted 3 times in Canada, working with Canadian lawyers. And then in Switzerland, where we scared Bush out of giving a speech in Switzerland because he feared prosecution. It got back to Bush that we were going to try to get him indicted in Switzerland for torture. So this is the first conviction anywhere of Bush and the rest of them for torture and war crimes. Efforts have been made in Spain and in Germany. So far, as WikiLeaks points out, the United States government has applied enormous pressure to both the Spanish governments and the German governments not to prosecute. So far that hasn't been done. But this is the first conviction. I think it's a good sign. We will be attempting to get this conviction enforced in all other states that are parties to the Convention Against Torture, and all other states that are parties to the Geneva Conventions of 1949, which in fact is almost every state in the world.
But the fact that this is a non-governmental tribunal, it's going to make it rather difficult to get governments to recognize it, isn't it?
Well, it'll be prima facie evidence of their guilt. pretty much like any other conviction around the world. If you have individuals convicted in one state, there's not necessarily any obligation by another state to prosecute those individuals. There could be an obligation to extradite if there is an extradition treaty in effect. So this is a question of enforcement of foreign judgments. It depends on treaties and statutes of the country involved, and also international comedy, principles of international legal comedy.
So how were you able to get something going at the ICC, and where is it at?
Right. Well, numerous complaints have been filed against Bush and the rest of them at the International Criminal Court, but they got nowhere because the United States government is not a party to the Rome Statute for the International Criminal Court. And I was the first one to figure out a way around this conundrum by filing a complaint against Bush, Cheney, Rumsfeld, Ashcroft, Gonzalez, Bybee, Tenet, and Rice for their policy of so-called extraordinary rendition, which, as I pointed out to the ICC, is really a euphemism for the enforced disappearance of human beings and torture, both of which are Rome statutory crimes. And as I pointed out to the ICC, these defendants have committed Rome statutory crimes in Rome party states. Indeed, most of Europe, where these extraordinary renditions in part took place, are parties to the Rome Statute, as well as Afghanistan. And therefore, I argued to the ICC that the court did have jurisdiction to prosecute them and should exercise that jurisdiction.
Well, how's the ICC responded to your argument?
They responded to me saying they gave me a docket number, they were inquiring into the matter, and they would get back to me in writing.
How long ago was that?
Pardon me?
How long ago was that?
That was 2 years. It's going to take time, obviously, because there's massive documentation of the extraordinary rendition policy and also the torture. So I believe they are engaging in a good faith investigation of this complaint, and I will get an answer.
Why do you believe that?
Well, because everyone before me has been rejected, and I have not been rejected in writing. They've all gotten letters from the ICC prosecutor's office saying we don't have jurisdiction to prosecute. That did not happen to me.
Right.
And they did promise a response in writing. In any event, we'll be filing the Kuala Lumpur judgment with the ICC, and I believe that will further support the complaint I already have against Bush and the rest of them.
Right. Now, what is the obligation, if any, on the Obama administration in regards to all of this? I mean, when President Obama was elected, he said it's time to look forward, not back, which a lot of people have suggested that would mean no crimes of any kind would ever be punished because it's always happened already. But is there any legal obligation on the Obama administration to investigate, prosecute, and if so, the fact that they haven't, what does that mean?
Yes, the Obama administration has all along had an obligation to prosecute Bush and the rest of them under the Convention Against Torture, including U.S. implementing legislation for that convention, making torture a crime, a felony, and in some circumstances punishable by death if death has occurred, which it has. Although I don't support the death penalty, but it does give you an idea of the severity of the crimes. And also the Obama administration has an obligation to prosecute these individuals under the 4 Geneva Conventions of 1949, including the U.S. Implementing legislation, the U.S. War Crimes Act. So there is an obligation by Obama to prosecute. Perhaps in a second term they might. We'll just have to see what happens. You are correct to indicate that so far they said they were looking to the forward and not to the past. I pointed out then to the ICC prosecutor that this is definitive proof that the Obama administration is not going to prosecute at this time, and therefore satisfies the element known as subsidiarity, which requires the ICC to defer to the national state for prosecution before the ICC steps in. And if you already have Obama and Holder saying they're not going to prosecute, that satisfies that requirement and puts it firmly in the hands of the ICC.
And is the Obama administration then itself in violation of the law by not pursuing it?
That's correct. It's clearly a violation of the Convention Against Torture and the four Geneva Conventions of 1949, and I regret to report, technically this would make them accessories after the fact to these offenses.
Right. Now, you focused on torture at the Malaysia tribunals, but why not the issue of the Iraq war itself? Kofi Annan was a little late coming, but eventually said the war was illegal. What is a bigger war crime than invading a country and killing several hundreds of thousands of people?
Yes, actually, we did that last November. The charge on torture and war crimes was charge 2. Charge 1, last November, I was out there for that prosecution as well. We prosecuted, indicted and then prosecuted Bush and Blair for committing a crime against peace by invading Iraq. And there were, again, close to 4 days of hearings. There were defense counsel, and a judgment did come back that Bush and Blair were guilty of crimes against peace for their invasion against Iraq. And we are making efforts to get that judgment enforced too. Obviously, these things take time. Pinochet stepped down as president of Chile, and it took 8 years before he was finally hauled to court there in Britain. So, if you're pursuing major war criminals such as Bush, Blair, Rumsfeld, Cheney, and the rest of them, you're not going to have justice tomorrow. You can take a look at the Balkans with Milosevic. I first went after him in the World Court in 1993 and finally got him indicted by the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia for what he did in Bosnia in 2000. So that took 7 years, and he was finally on trial for these crimes. Unfortunately, he died before we were able to get a final verdict. So, you have to view these things as a long-term effort.
Thanks very much for joining us.
Well, again, thanks for having me on, and my best to Real News. Keep the good work up.
Thank you. And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.
No.
Give me a hug.
No way.
Come here.
I'm not coming over there.
Let's go.
Forget it.
Pronto.
What are you doing?
I'm with it. I'm hip. Well, don't look at me like I'm frickin' Frankenstein. Give your father a hug.
Hey,
Come on, hug.
touch
hug.
me.
Hug. Hug.
Get away from me, you lazy-eyed psycho.
Who do we have?
I'm saying. They're gonna get
Knock, knock.
Who's there?
Look, let me tell you a little story about a man named Even before you start, that was a preemptive Just know I have a whole bag of with your name on it.